The wind moved through the pine needles like it had somewhere to be sharp, deliberate, and cold enough to bite bone. In the foothills of Montana Territory, 1883, even the sun seemed reluctant to shine. Clouds hung low over the jagged ridges, and the little town at the edge of the woods wore winter like a curse. Most folks stayed inside when the weather turned mean, but not here. Not where trade came cheap and silence sold faster than sugar. The sign above the stall was slanted, painted in weather-faded red, trade and labor, no questions asked. Beneath it stood men with whiskey breath and coin-heavy pockets passing around crates of rusted nails, moldy cloth, and the occasional stolen mule. A place where nothing good ever started, and most deals ended with someone regretting they'd come at all. Silas Boone had no intention of buying anything but a whetstone. He'd told himself that on the trail, and again when he tied his horse to a splintered post. At 41, Silas had outlived a war, a wife, and too many cold nights alone in a cabin built with his own hands. His buffalo hide coat smelled of wood smoke and old leather. One gloved hand stayed tucked inside his satchel. The other hung near his belt knife, a habit he never lost after the war. Then he heard the voice. White girl, 23, strong hips, has a baby, no husband, no disease, no price set. It wasn't the words that made Silas turn. It was the silence that followed, the kind that curdled the air and made men cough or pretend to look away. At the edge of the crowd, beneath a sagging canvas tent, stood a man with a broken lip and eyes too eager. Beside him, a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, pale, ragged, her dress torn at the shoulder hair loose, holding a bundled baby tight to her chest. "Got thrown out of Silver Bluff," the seller called out. Even the pastor's boy wouldn't claim her once that brat showed up. A few men chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one stepped forward. Silas didn't move either until the handler, grinning like a wolf, reached toward the child. "We could split 'em," he said. "Lady over in Dry Hollows looking for an infant." "No," the word sliced through the cold like a knife. The woman jerked back, shielding the baby. Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't flinch. "Take me, not her." The handler grabbed her arm, and the baby began to wail high and scared. Silas stepped forward, slowly. No words, no threats. From his satchel, he pulled out $2 earned honest during one of the few good seasons trapping and dropped them into the frozen mud. The sound echoed more than it should have. "Come with me," he said simply. The seller blinked. The handler froze. The woman looked up. 10 feet of snowy ground stretched between them. She searched his face like she was measuring risk and loss, weighing whether this quiet stranger might be less cruel than what she already knew. Her expression wasn't desperate, just done. The kind of tired that no sleep fixes. Her baby clutched her shawl tighter, tiny fists trembling. Silas extended his hand again. This time she moved. The seller scoffed. $2. You want the woman and the kid that don't even." Silas turned his head slightly, voice cold as steel. "Take another step toward her, and I'll show you what I brought home from Antietam." That shut him up. The woman, Clara, though he didn't know that yet, stood beside him now. Shivering, but not from fear. From the weight of what she had just done. Chosen something unknown over something unbearable. Silas didn't touch her, not until they reached the edge of the crowd. Then he placed a hand lightly against her back, not to lead, not to claim, just to shield her from behind. They didn't look back. Not once. The baby's cries softened into little hiccups. The $silver lay half buried in the churned-up snow and mud, and for a long moment, in a place where men yelled louder than the wind, silence settled like fog. They didn't speak, didn't need to, but from that moment on, neither of them walked alone. The trail to Silas Boone's cabin was steep and barely visible under the thick quilt of snow that had blanketed the mountain overnight. The wind cut sideways through the trees, spitting frost at anything foolish enough to move through it. Silas walked steadily, leading his mare with one hand and offering his other arm to the woman Clara, though her name had yet to be spoken aloud between them. Her steps were slow, deliberate, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She held the baby close beneath the thick buffalo hide coat Silas had wordlessly draped over her shoulders. They didn't speak. There were no introductions, no demands, no questions. And to Clara, that silence was a gift greater than shelter. For weeks, her entire existence had been up for judgment. Her child's cries, her ruined dress the shape of her hips. But now, here in the middle of a frozen forest, trudging beside a man who kept his words buried deeper than his tracks, she felt no pressure to explain why she existed at all. By the time they reached the cabin, nestled between cliff and creek, dusk had turned the sky a dull slate. Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a thin ribbon curling into the cold like it didn't want to leave. The house itself was modest, just 2 rooms, a patchwork roof and shutters that hung askew like tired eyelids. But to Clara, it looked like something ancient and steady, like it had never moved even when the whole world had tried to. Silas pushed the door open and stepped aside. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of pine ash and boiled oats. A fire glowed low in the hearth. Simple furnishings, rough-built chairs, a table with notched legs, a curtain separating the sleeping space waited in quiet order. Clara stepped in slowly, her feet aching from the cold. She winced as she lowered herself into the rocker Silas pointed to near the fire. The baby, little Rose, was fast asleep now, cheek pressed to her mother's collarbone, breath warm against her skin. Clara leaned back and let out a soft sigh, not of peace, but of something close. Her arms trembled from holding the child so tightly for so long. Her fingers were red raw at the knuckles. She didn't realize how tired she was until the warmth of the cabin began to sink in. Silas moved without sound. He filled a kettle and set it over the fire, then lit a lantern in the corner and rummaged in a cabinet until he found oats honey and a cracked wooden bowl. He stirred them slowly in a cast-iron pot, back turned, giving her space without making a show of it. Clara blinked hard, struggling to stay upright. "You can rest," Silas said, his voice low, a scratch of gravel wrapped in something gentle. She wanted to argue, say she could handle it, say she didn't need anything. But the words never came. Her body betrayed her. She shifted her grip on Rose, trying to stay alert, but her eyelids slid shut heavy with the weight of too many sleepless nights. When she woke, it was still night. The fire was still glowing, the cabin still warm, but Rose was gone from her arms. Clara bolted upright, heart-pounding hair wild. Then she saw them across the room in the rocker. Silas sat with Rose curled against his chest, her tiny fingers tangled in the gray threads of his beard. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes were closed, his arms wrapped around the baby, as if she were carved into the space between his ribs. One of her little hands tugged gently at the collar of his shirt, and then a sound Clara hadn't heard from a man in years. A chuckle, deep quiet, surprised, like a man learning what it meant to laugh again. Clara didn't speak, she only watched. Rose drooled on his shirt. Silas didn't flinch. Finally, Clara whispered, "Don't take her. Please, she's all I have." He opened his eyes, calm, steady, like a river that had been running beneath ice all winter. "I'm not taking her," he said. "She's with you, and you're both with me." There were no conditions, no contracts, Just the kind of sentence that settles into your chest and stays there warming the places you thought were frostbitten. Clara didn't say thank you. Words like that felt too small. Instead, she accepted a warm bowl of oats with honey. She fed Rose, then ate in slow aching spoonfuls. Silas rolled out a cot near the fire and gave her the blanket without a word. When he returned to the rocker, Rose stirred again and curled against his side. Clara lay on her back, eyes on the ceiling beams above. The baby sighed. The fire cracked, and for the first time since being cast out of Silver Bluff, her heart did not hammer from fear. Outside, the snow whispered. Inside, they slept, and between them, something unnamed, small, fragile, alive began to grow. The snow didn't stop for weeks. It piled high against the cabin walls, pressed against the window panes like a silent guest, and buried the trail so deep it vanished entirely. But inside the little house, tucked between mountain and creek, something else began to take root. Not warmth exactly. Warmth could be built with fire. This was slower, quieter, a kind of trust born from repetition, from showing up in the same space again and again without breaking it. Silas didn't speak much, but he didn't leave either. Each morning, he showed Clara how to feed the stove without filling the room with smoke, how to set traps along the tree line for snowshoe hares, how to watch the frost on the windows for signs of a coming thaw. He never corrected her with words, only gentle taps on her wrist or a patient shake of the head. She watched. She learned. Her hands, once stiff from cold, and nerves began to move with purpose. Indoors, she found a basket of torn linens stuffed under the old bed and began stitching. First, out of habit, then to pass the time. Then, because something about mending something broken felt like defiance. She patched Silas's coat, reinforced the knees of his trousers, and even stitched her own dress back into a shape that resembled dignity. The needle had belonged to Silas's late wife. Clara figured that out from the box he handed her, wordless, carved with an old name she didn't ask about. He never said thank you. Instead, the next day, there was a spool of thread left by the fire. Rose, sweet squirming. Rose became the center of their days. She giggled when the wind rattled the shutters and squealed every time Silas's beard came within arm's reach. Her laugh was bright and sudden, like a bird startled into song, and once it rang through the cabin, nothing felt the same after. One afternoon, while Clara stirred tea over the stove, she noticed Silas sitting at the table. He was carving something slow and focused. She didn't ask, just watched him. Hours passed. Then he stood, wiped wood dust from his hands, and placed a tiny wooden spoon on the table. The name Rose was carved into the handle. Clara picked it up with shaking fingers, the edge of her thumb brushing over the rough grooves of the lettering. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the spoon." Silas gave a small shrug. She needed one, but she knew it wasn't about the spoon. That night, the cabin settled into its rhythm. Clara fed Rose from the new spoon. Silas stacked more wood by the hearth, and when the wind howled outside, the fire never dipped low enough to matter. Yet not everything softened. One morning, Clara slipped on a patch of black ice near the creek. Her ankle twisted sharply, and a jagged branch tore a deep slice across her forearm. She cried out more from surprise than pain, and tried to hobble home alone. She didn't get far. Silas found her limping near the edge of the trail, her breath clouding the air, her eyes wet but defiant. He said nothing, just bent low, scooped her up like she weighed nothing, and carried her back through the snow. Inside, he cleaned the cut with a cloth dipped in pine salve. As he rolled up her sleeve, he saw it an old scar, long and sharp, running from elbow to wrist. Not accidental, not natural. His hands froze. "I was 16, Clara said, her voice flat. They said I smiled too much. Said I walked too free. The boy who hurt me, his daddy, was the preacher. They called me temptation. Said it was my fault. Said the scar was proof. Silas didn't respond right away. He reached for a clean cloth, soaked it in warm water, and pressed it gently to the skin, not on the scar but around it. Soft. Careful. You never needed saving, he said, quiet as falling ash. Clara looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, but her gaze held steady. You just needed someone who wouldn't walk away. She didn't cry. She just breathed long and deep, her fingers loosening where they'd curled into her dress. For the first time, the shame didn't rise in her throat like fire. For the first time, her story didn't feel like a verdict. Silas stood, took up his knife and a piece of wood, and sat by the hearth. Not to carve, just to hold something steady in his hands. Clara wrapped herself in the patched coat he'd given her and watched him for a long while. Outside, snowflakes drifted soft and slow. Inside, something stronger than fire began to stir. By the end of March, the snow began to surrender. Slush replaced drifts. The creek near the cabin, once still and locked beneath ice, began to murmur again. Winter released its grip in fits and starts, but the forest knew what was coming. Buds nudged their way onto the trees. The morning air smelled different, less like smoke, more like thawing earth. But the thaw brought more than new growth. Silas was out splitting logs by the stump when he spotted them two riders moving slow through the pines. One wore a coat too fine for this kind of land wool trim stitched with city arrogance. The other, taller, lean and rigid, rode like he didn't know how to belong among trees. Even from a distance, Silas felt it trouble. Not the kind with fists or pistols, but the kind that came folded in paper and cloaked in law. Clara stepped out of the cabin just as the men dismounted. She carried a bucket of water, her braid unbound cheeks pink from the cold. The moment she saw the tall one, the bucket slipped from her hands. Her voice caught. "Graham." The man smiled, sharp as a knife. "Hello, Clara. I heard you made yourself a little cabin family. With my daughter." Silas moved to stand beside her. Quiet, watchful, the other man stepped forward, holding a folded document. "My name is Ezra Quinn. I represent Mr. Graham Harrow, biological father of one Evangelina Harrow. We have a signed affidavit from Judge Mercer in Dry Creek. It states the mother removed the child without consent. We're here to reclaim the child and ensure proper custody." Clara's voice shook, but her spine stayed straight. "You cast me out," she said. "You called me filth, said the baby wasn't yours. You left me in a pool of my own blood. Be that as it may," Quinn interrupted, smoothing the paper, "this document makes her legally his." Silas didn't speak. "Not yet." Graham took a step forward, his smile curdled with victory. "Come on now. Hand her over. You've had your fantasy. Let's be reasonable." Clara didn't flinch. "You never wanted her until she gave you something to control." He laughed. "You think this mountain man gets to decide what's mine?" It was then that Silas moved. One step, no raised voice, no drawn weapon. "She's not yours," he said, eyes fixed and unmoved. "She never was." Before Graham could argue, another sound rippled through the trees, hoofbeats, fast and close. 3 riders appeared through the last curtain of pine. Silas recognized them instantly. Reverend Jameson, half blind, but still riding straight. Finch, the ex-investigator, now with a thick folder tucked beneath his coat. And behind them a Dry Creek deputy badge shining in the weak spring light. The deputy dismounted, glancing at the tension like it was a rope ready to snap. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "your custody order's been revoked pending investigation. We have credible evidence of misconduct and witness statements that contradict your claims." Quinn sputtered. On what grounds? Finch handed over the folder. 20 pages, names, testimonies, bribes, and a letter from a girl who disappeared after Graham threatened her in '81. Reverend Jameson stood beside Silas' now weathered hand resting on his cane. I remember what he did, and what she endured. God may forgive, but truth doesn't forget. Graham paled. Clara stood firm, Rose now nestled in her arms, small, and blinking at the strangers who had arrived like winter's ghost. I'd burn this forest to ash before I hand her to you, she said, eyes locked on Graham. The deputy nodded once. This isn't over, but for now you leave, and you don't come back without cause. Graham hesitated, then turned. Not a word more. That night, the cabin was warm again. Clara knelt by the fire, tears drying on her cheeks, but her lips curved with something deeper than relief. Silas sat with Rose in his lap, the baby curled into his chest like she knew nothing had changed, because for her, nothing had. And that, Silas thought, was the whole point. For once, nobody had walked away. In the days after Graham Harrow's failed attempt to claim Rose's silence returned to the cabin, but not the kind that chilled. This quiet was different, watchful, protective, a held breath that hadn't quite exhaled yet. Rose fell ill 2 nights later. At first it was a soft whimper in her sleep. Then came the fever, sharp and fast, lighting her skin and dulling her eyes. Clara knelt by the cot, wringing a cloth over a basin, while Silas paced from hearth to bedside, checking the kettle, adjusting blankets, touching her forehead with the back of his weathered hand. She won't eat, Clara said, her voice cracking. She's never quiet this long. She's too little to carry fear like that, Silas murmured, so we'll carry it for her. He sat by the cot, boots off, shirt collar open, and held Rose's hand through the night. Every so often, the child would stir and reach. Each time, her tiny fingers grazed his beard, and her breathing would steady. Just that small touch, and she calmed. Clara watched from the chair in the corner, too tired to cry, too awake to sleep. In those moments, she saw something in Silas she hadn't let herself believe in yet. Fatherhood carved not by blood, but by the constancy of presence. He had shown up in every hour that hurt without being asked. By dawn, Rose's fever broke, but the air outside still whispered of unfinished things. 2 mornings later, Finch returned on horseback, drenched in sleet, cradling a bundle of documents in oilcloth and a single yellowed paper. He stepped inside and held it out to Silas. In '81, Graham's father paid off 2 witnesses $200 each. I found the original payment ledger. County clerk misfiled it. It's enough. Silas nodded, slow and grim. Then we pushed back. That same afternoon, Reverend Jameson, who had once preached at Graham's father's church, rode into town to swear his statement. Though his eyes were clouded and his hands shook, his voice never faltered. I saw what he did, the Reverend said, and I know what was done to that girl. The Lord may show mercy, but the law owes her justice. Finch filed a motion in Dry Creek that night, petitioning to terminate Graham Harrow's paternal rights and secure permanent custody for Clara and Rose. The court date was set for the following week. It rained the whole ride into town. Clara rode in silence, Rose bundled against her chest in a sling Silas had stitched from spare cloth. Silas rode beside them, jaw tight, eyes forward. Neither of them had been in a courtroom before. They didn't talk about what might happen. They only rode. The courthouse in Dry Creek was squat and gray, with old red bricks that looked like they'd been laid angry. Inside the room, buzzed with the hush of gossip held just under the surface. Graham sat smug at the plaintiff's table, clean-shaven coat pressed with Ezra Quinn beside him, whispering from a folder. When called, Graham stood hands folded like a sermon. "I believed my daughter had died," he said smoothly. "I was misled. I sought her only out of concern and fatherly obligation." Clara stood before the judge and did not shake. "I was 17, she said. "He called me temptation. When I told the truth, his father paid to bury it. And when I refused to disappear, he made sure the town spit me out. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted silence." She placed her hand on Rose's small back. "She is not my sin. She is my salvation." The judge, a silver-haired woman with a pinched mouth and steady eyes, held up the yellowed bribery ledger. "This," she said, "is not protection. It's cowardice dressed in coin." Then she looked to Clara. "You raised this child when no one stood with you. You did not ask the law for help. You earned her safety with your own hands. And now you ask not for revenge, but peace." The gavel struck like thunder. Custody terminated. Clara Ridley is recognized as sole legal guardian of Evangelina Rose Ridley. Further investigation into coercion and misconduct is recommended. No one cheered, no one clapped, but Graham left without looking back, and that was victory enough. Outside, Clara stood in the rain with Rose nestled tight in her arms. The sky had softened to gray, and the street smelled of wet clay and relief. Silas stood beside her, quiet as ever. "She doesn't know what just happened," Clara said, looking down at Rose's drowsy face. "She doesn't have to," Silas replied. "That's why we did it." That night, back at the cabin, the fire glowed steady. Clara stripped off Rose's damp clothes and bathed her gently by the hearth, then wrapped her in a blanket so warm it felt like the end of a long war. When she turned to the table, she noticed something tucked under the carved spoon Silas had made weeks ago. It was a piece of paper folded in half. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was uneven ink blotted where the pen had lingered too long. It read, "For Clara, who was never owned, only chosen." She pressed it to her chest. Her breath shuddered out, but it wasn't pain this time. It was peace. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, one stubborn patch of green at a time. First came the puddles, dark and cold beneath the pines. Then the sound of meltwater trickling through the creek like a secret finally being told. By mid-April, color began to return to the land, and so did something else, hope. Clara was the first to notice the wild daisies pushing up beside the cabin steps. Tiny, white-petaled, yellow-eyed flowers poking through thawed soil like they'd never known fear. She smiled when she saw them stooping down with Rose on her hip. "Look, baby," she whispered. "The mountain's waking up." Silas had noticed them days before but hadn't said a word. Instead, he brought out a small pouch of seeds and a weathered spade. He spent an afternoon turning patches of earth around the cabin, wide circles, uneven but purposeful. When Rose toddled after him, clapping her hands at the tiny buds, he paused and ruffled her curls. Her laugh filled the air like wind chimes. That spring, daisies grew everywhere. Not because they belonged there, but because someone made space for them. Inside, change happened just as quietly. Silas built a narrow shelf from pine and nailed it above the hearth. On it, Clara placed her small collection of books, an old poetry volume, a folk-tale anthology, and a primer she'd once used to teach herself to read by firelight. Now she used them to teach Rose, and not just Rose. Word had begun to travel. A trapper passed through and told a rancher's wife about the woman in the mountains who taught letters and mended coats. Then another. By May, children from as far as 5 miles away arrived on muleback or walked hand in hand with their mothers to Clara's doorstep. Twice a week, the little cabin filled with muddy boots and bright eyes. Laughter bounced off the beams. Shoes cluttered the corners. Pencils dulled to nubs. Silas never joined the lessons. Instead, he whittled on the porch, fixing tools or carving scraps of wood into new shapes. But he always stayed close enough to listen. And when Clara asked what he was working on one afternoon, he simply said, "Stools. For the children." That night, Rose traced her name in the ash beside the fire, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth in concentration. "More stories, Mama," she said, pointing to the shelf. Clara looked to Silas. He stood, picked up the old book of fables, its spine nearly detached, and handed it to her. "Only if your mother picks the tail." Clara chuckled and opened to a dog-eared page. But her voice caught on the second line, and without pause, Silas picked up where she left off. He stumbled through the name of a fairy queen, and the children erupted with giggles. The days melted into weeks. Saplings sprouted outside. Rose grew faster than Clara could sew. Her curls were always wild, her knees always scraped, and her hands forever reaching for something to learn. She followed Silas into the woods, naming herbs and animal tracks like sacred things. One evening, after the last student had gone, Clara stood on the porch and the fading light flower still dusted on her sleeves. Silas was at the hearth, stirring embers, the firelight gilding the worn lines of his face. Something glinted on the mantel. Clara stepped closer. It was a ring, not gold, not silver. Wood dark and smooth, carved from mountain walnut. The grain shimmered in the light, and etched inside the curve was a daisy stem curling into the letter C. She held it in her palm. "Does this mean I'm yours?" she asked softly. Silas didn't turn. He watched the flames a moment longer, then said, "No. It means I'm yours." The words hung in the air, warm and quiet as the fire itself. She smiled and slid the ring onto her finger. There was no kiss, no ceremony, just the sound of the forest outside and the breath of a sleeping child behind them. They didn't need a vow. They already had one. Later that night, they sat close enough to share a single blanket. Not touching, not speaking. Just watching the fire crackle, the steam rising from 2 mugs of tea and the moonlight soft on the windowsill. Outside, the daisies swayed in the breeze. Inside, there was no performance, only presence, and that they both knew was the only kind of forever worth choosing. By the time summer pressed its warmth into the soil, the cabin at Wilder Ridge had changed. The land still hummed with the same wild sounds, wind through the trees, the low gurgle of the creek, but now smoke from the chimney meant something more than fire. It meant life. It meant someone was home. Laughter drifted across the porch most evenings, soft and easy. Above the gate hung with nails Silas had blackened in the fire, a wooden sign greeted the world. The Wilders' Silas, Clara, Rose. He had carved it in the early hours before sunrise, then stepped back with arms crossed, unsure if he'd done too much. When Clara saw it, she only smiled her fingers, brushing the grooves. "You finally told the world, and the world listened. Not all at once. But word traveled slow through the hills, as it always did. A passing cattleman spoke of a quiet mountain man and the woman who taught children to read. Then came a boy with a broken wrist. Then a widow who needed tea more than medicine. Clara never turned them away. She tied up loaves of bread in twine, sent them off with notes that read, "This one's still warm. Share it while it is." Rose grew up in the center of it all. Brave as a fox, wild as the wind. She knew the names of birds before she could spell her own. She trailed behind Silas on hikes, her voice echoing through the trees. Her favorite spot was a stump near the edge of the ridge where she sketched animals on scraps of paper and named the stars out loud. One night, she climbed onto Silas's lap, a piece of twine looped in her fingers. "I want ribbon," she declared. blue like Mama's eyes. Clara chuckled. "Ribbon, is it?" Silas didn't say anything that night, but the next morning he saddled the mule. It had been 12 years since he rode into town. Clara raised a brow when he tightened the reins. "You're going to town," he nodded. "We need sugar," she smiled. "Don't forget the ribbon." The town hadn't changed. Dirt streets, crowded storefronts. The dry goods clerk didn't recognize him but smiled when he saw the items on the counter. Sugar a book of folk tales and a spool of satin ribbon blue as a robin's egg. "You got a little girl?" the clerk asked. Silas nodded. "The best one." That evening, Rose ran out to meet him, eyes glowing. When he handed her the ribbon, she gasped and clutched it to her chest like treasure. Inside, Clara unpacked the Rest Sugar soap and the book she once said she missed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything." That night, as Rose lay asleep with her hair tied in a crooked bow, Silas and Clara sat on the porch beneath a sky smeared with stars. They sipped tea in silence the way people do when words aren't needed to feel full. "Do you remember that day?" Clara asked softly. "The trade post." Silas nodded. "You looked at me like I was a wolf." She smiled. "And you looked at me like I wasn't broken." He reached for her hand. "You never were." They sat like that for a long time until the moon had climbed past the ridge. Inside, beside Rose's little bed, the wooden spoon still rested her name carved into the handle. Above the door frame, barely visible after seasons of weather and use, one line remained carved into the wood. For Clara, who was never owned, only chosen. And Rose understood now. Love didn't always come with trumpets or ceremony. It didn't ask for witnesses or declarations. Real love, the kind that stayed, was quiet, patient. It showed up in firewood stacked by the door, in blue ribbon on a little girl's hair, in mended clothes and warm bread wrapped in twine. It came not in being rescued, but in being chosen, again and again. Love, real love, isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or parade itself for proof. It grows in the quiet corners of life, in the hard days, the healing hours, and the moments when you're not sure anyone sees you at all. The world may tell you that love has to be earned or won or fought for, but the truth is, the best kind of love is simply offered, freely, without conditions. Silas never asked Clara to prove herself. He didn't save her, he saw her. And Clara, in return, didn't fix him, she welcomed him. In a world that had tried to break them both, they chose each other day after day without ceremony or debt. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You don't need to be unbroken to be chosen. Sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with a simple act of kindness, a coat offered in silence, a carved spoon, a ring made of wood. So, if this story moved you, if you believe in the kind of love that is built, not bought, that chooses rather than saves, leave a comment below. Tell us what your Wilder Ridge moment is. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West love stories where hearts don't just survive, they rise.